Syria's civil war has been reignited. In late November 2024, a coalition of rebel forces began a massive offensive against the Syrian government, forcing them to abandon huge swaths of territory while various factions grabbed as much land as they could. The government under Bashar al-Assad has now collapsed, and the situation in Syria changed completely. Now alliances are reshuffling while outside powers are trying to influence what is going on. The speed of this development has been staggering, so let's recap what has actually happened in Syria and how will the drastic changes affect the Middle East and global geopolitics. To answer that, let's first look at the factions involved and how the situation looked shortly before all of these events. This map shows the political situation in Syria as it basically existed from 2020 until the start of the rebel offensive in late November 2024. In red, we have the areas that were controlled by the Syrian government, led by Bashar al-Assad and the Syrian Ba'athist Party. During the first years of the civil war, Assad's rule was hanging by a thread until Iran, with its regional proxies, as well as Russia, intervened on his behalf, allowing his forces to recapture a lot of territory. Ideologically, Assad represents a wide mix of socialist and Arab nationalist ideas, while in practice, his rule has been characterized by authoritarianism, the brutal persecution of political opponents, and nepotism. Assad is also a member of the Alawite religious minority that predominantly inhabits the coast, which is why his rule seemed most stable there. Then we have the anti-government rebel coalition, displayed in two shades of green. The light green area, centered around the city of Idlib, is controlled by an alliance network of numerous militant organizations, most of which can be characterized as radical Sunni Islamist or jihadist groups. The strongest and leading organization here is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or short HTS, which was formed in 2017 out of multiple such organizations, including the Al-Nusra Front, an Al-Qaeda affiliate. Since 2018, the group has been widely recognized as a terrorist organization, but over the past years, HTS leaders have tried to change the outside perception of the group to appear more moderate. They've promised to protect the rights of Syria's religious and ethnic minorities. How sincere these promises really are in the long term is, however, questionable, as its fighters and leaders have a long history of acting in direct opposition to these promises. The current leader of the HTS, for example, was affiliated with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS in the past. The dark green area, meanwhile, is controlled by the Syrian National Army, which is also a collection of various militant groups and some foreign fighters. They too were founded in 2017 at the initiative of Turkey, which is the main supporter and supplier of funds and equipment. Unsurprisingly, the Syrian National Army is closely aligned with Turkey and usually acts in the interest of the Turkish state. They were, for example, not only fighting against Assad's forces, but are also fighting against Kurdish groups in the north and northeast that Turkey does not want there. This is in contrast to the HDS, whose activities are less aligned with Ankara. For example, the HDS has shown more interest in negotiating with Kurdish-led forces, known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, or SDF. The SDF controls the Yellow Territories and consists predominantly of Kurds, but also includes some Arab groups in the southeast. Especially their relationship with other actors is quite complicated. It's supported by the US and some other Western states, particularly for their fight against ISIS, but at the same time they had a quasi-alliance with the Assad government for years and got some support from Russia. In the last few years, the SDF has been mainly fighting against the Syrian National Army in Turkey in order to retain the Kurdish autonomy they've established. Lastly, there are a few smaller factions still worth mentioning. In the deserts of eastern Syria, there are still some small pockets of members of ISIS that are still active. In the southwest, there is a small US-backed group known as the New Syrian Army that controls a desert near the main border crossing with Iraq, where a US military base is also located. And in southern Syria, there are multiple rebel groups that were initially fighting against Assad but later entered into an agreement with the government. But this situation has changed dramatically since the rebel coalition's offensive began in late November 2024. While this attack was surprising to many, it did not occur out of nowhere. Between 2020 and 2024, there were negotiations between many factions and outside powers to perhaps find a political solution, but these went nowhere. In the meantime, Assad's position in Syria weakened as his closest allies got distracted by other conflicts. For Russia, its war in Ukraine is currently taking up most of its attention and resources, while Iran has been focused on Israel and the wars in Gaza and Lebanon. This allowed the rebel coalition to consolidate and prepare for a future confrontation with Turkish support. As a consequence, the Syrian army and its allies were unable to repel the attack, which first caused a massive retreat of their forces in northwestern Syria. Very quickly, the important cities of Aleppo and Hama fell under their control, which caused even more retreats by government forces, while defections became commonplace. This encouraged other rebel groups to join the fray as well. In southern Syria, a collection of rebel groups that were previously in an agreement with Assad rose up again, calling themselves the Southern Operations Room. They too made very fast gains, and in a matter of days took over the outskirts of the capital Damascus. Back north, the HTS continued its advance and quickly took over the important city of Homs. In the meantime, SDF units took over abandoned government positions along the Euphrates River. The US-backed new Syrian army then also advanced, taking over the city of Palmyra in the eastern Syria and moving into Damascus from the northeast. Soon after, all government forces had either fled or surrendered, and local militias took over in places where the main factions had not reached yet, even in the Alevite Syrian coast region that was previously thought to be Assad's stronghold. Within just 11 days, the 50-year rule of the Assad family in Syria had come to an end. At the time this video was released, the exact whereabouts of Bashar al-Assad were still unknown, but it seems that he has been granted asylum in Moscow. But wherever he is, it's clear that a new chapter in Syrian history has begun. But before we talk about what might be next for Syria, what does this mean for the major outside players? Among the anti-Assad powers, Turkey might be the biggest winner. It may become the most influential outside player in all of Syria and has reached two of its key objectives: to oust Assad and to prop up the Syrian opposition, which is now in control of most of the country. However, this is likely not the end of Turkish ambitions here, because another of their key objectives is to end or at least significantly reduce the Kurdish presence in northern Syria, which Ankara believes is strengthening Kurdish separatism within Turkey. The United States is also very happy about Assad being gone, which also likely means an end to Russian and Iranian influence here. However, there are problems. Many of Syria's rebel groups, like the HTS, are way too radical for its liking and might become a problem for the future, especially in regards to its ally Israel. For Israel, the situation is somewhat awkward. On the one hand, it has long been keen on seeing Assad gone as he is a close ally of Iran, but at the same time, it is not really interested in seeing Syria being led by Islamist jihadist movements, under which Syria could again represent a big threat to it. One point of contention will likely be the Golan Heights, which are internationally recognized as Syrian territory but have been occupied by Israel since 1967. And Israel is already preparing for a potential confrontation. It has recently taken over the UN buffer zone surrounding the Golan Heights and conducted air raids in southern Syria and Damascus that are supposed to destroy government equipment before it falls into the hands of rebel factions. The pro-Assad powers, meanwhile, find themselves in an incredibly bad spot. For Russia, Syria has represented the main gateway for Moscow's influence in the Middle East and also harbors two extremely important Russian military facilities that are vital for the country's Mediterranean presence. According to some reports, the Russian military has already begun to evacuate these bases. Whether the Russian presence in Syria will soon be gone for good or perhaps somehow continue through an agreement with the leading factions is very unclear. For Iran, the situation may even be worse. Syria was an important link to its ally Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is now likely cut off. Now Iran has entered into a diplomatic dialogue with Syrian factions, including the HTS, in order to trade the security of Shiite minorities and the many Shiite holy sites in Syria for an Iranian acceptance of the new Syrian government. Whether this will work will be shown within the next weeks and months. But what about Syria itself? What will a post-Assad Syria look like? Well, it's difficult to say. At the moment this video was released, many Syrians and outside observers were hopeful. The brutal rule of the Assad family is finally over, and surprisingly with very little bloodshed as well. If things go well, there will be a transitional government/council formed in which all factions within Syria will ideally negotiate a peaceful political solution for the entire country. Part of this may be the granting of some degree of autonomy to the country's minorities, including the Kurds, Alevites and Druze. But at the same time, the cause which had now unified many factions, namely to topple Assad, is now gone, and the various factions left in Syria have different backers, goals and ideas for how Syria should be governed. If the negotiations between them stall in the coming weeks, what will stop them from fighting against each other? In such a scenario, we could see Syria devolve into another civil war. And let's not forget that the situation along the Turkish border could soon escalate too. There is already fighting going on between the Turkish-backed Syrian National Army and the Kurdish-led SDF on the west bank of the Euphrates River. With Assad gone, the Turkish government may see this as an opportunity to conduct a large-scale intervention in order to push Kurdish forces further south, although much will depend on how the US will react, which is currently supporting the SDF. Whatever happens now, let's hope that the people of Syria, which for years have endured incredible violence and destruction, will finally get a chance for peace. I hope you found this video helpful. Here's another video you might find interesting. A big thank you to all my patrons and channel members who make these videos possible. See you in the next one. Bye.